Greetings, my name is Crystal Turner, and I would like to take this opportunity to present to all my interpersonal communication project for Human Services 508 with Dr. Rita Smith as my professor. Next slide, please. What is interpersonal communication anyway? According to Stewart, interpersonal labels the kind of communication that happens when people involved talk and listen in ways that maximizes the presence of the personal. Next slide, please. Throughout this presentation, I will identify the following: my overarching goal that can help enhance and influence my communication abilities. Also, I will discuss enlarging the conversation, my behavioral blend and its positive and negative influence in conversation, my potential roadblocks or barriers from an interpersonal perspective, and identifying the key components that can be used to ultimately help me to overcome those barriers, internal and external noise pollution and its effects, and finally, my plan of action to implement my overarching goal to positively affect my interpersonal communication skills and possibly to help encourage others to explore the unfamiliar territory in communication. Next slide, please. Let's begin by taking a look at my overarching goal. My overarching goal can be summed up in just a few words: to become a more effective listener and communicator. Not to toot my own horn, but prior to this course, I considered myself an influential individual that listens to the thoughts, concerns, stories, and issues of others with an effective ear. Based on the information that is presented to me by the talker, I would respond accordingly. Contrary to my thought process or the definition of the word, listening has a much more broader scope and can be explored in a more in-depth nature from what has been presented to me in my past time. By simply becoming a more effective listener and communicator, this can change the altitude of my conversation as a whole while enlarging my conversation in the process. Next slide, please. Enlarging the conversation has been viewed from the aspects of allowing others to provide their insights on a larger group scale, to provide more ideas, thoughts, and opinions on a particular subject matter. However, after further research, enlarging the conversation means much more than that. It means to expand the approach to identifying the needs in communication while focusing on the resources that can be brought forth, that can bring forth resolution to those needs. Next slide, please. Stewart identified 6 qualities of communication types, which include meaning. Communication is the process of collaboratively making meaning, which makes up our world today. Choice, by way of communication, we consider or follow. By way of culture, which means from an ethnicity side, gender, age, social class, sexual orientation, and other cultural features affect communication and are affected by it as well. Identities involves negotiating identities or selves. Conversation, which is most influential, just talking away itself. Nexting, responding fruitfully to what has happened, helpful next. These practical applications or principles can serve as resourceful means to enlarging any conversation. Next slide, please. In the earlier weeks of this course, I completed 2 assessments which have helped me to identify and understand my personal behavioral blend: Discovery Health Interpersonal Skills Test Assessment and a Uniquely You Profile. Next slide, please. After I completed my Discovery Health Assessment, I obtained a score of 96 out of 100 overall. According to these results, it specified that I'm a very excellent communicator, but most importantly, I have the ability to put my communication skills into practice throughout my everyday interaction with others. Next slide, please. Carbonell identifies 4 temperaments to help establish the uniquely you profile to determine your behavioral blend. This profile is laid out in a disc form, which is charted here in the presentation. Behavioral blend through the uniquely you profile was very beneficial to me. Most people tend to have one or more personality types that are combined to formulate your own personal, unique behavioral blend. Next slide, please. The uniquely you profile provides the following. In graph 1, this is expected of me, which is how I think people expect me to behave. And in graph 2, this is me, simply is my normal unmasked behaviors. Next slide, please. My personal behavioral blend is identified as following. In graph 1, which is again, this is expected of me, I am a personality type S. Carbonell describes S personality types as stable and shy types, does not like change often. Talking in front of a large crowd can be somewhat difficult. In graph 2, this is me, my personality type is CIS. And it really honed into me. I like to do things right. I'm impressive to others and I like to be stable. I'm not aggressive or pushy at all. And I'm very sensitive about how others view me as well as view my work. Thank you. Next slide. Well, as you know, there are positives and negatives associated with my behavioral blend. The positives associated or aspects outlined are obedient and loyal, encouraging, good friend to others, caring, kind, and a great listener, and I'm capable of handling most difficult situations. Unfortunately, there is a negative side. My negative aspects are I'm too patient and I'm too kind, which can sometimes allow other people to take advantage of me. My willingness to carry people's burdens. I want to take it all away from them and so they won't have to worry anymore. I sometimes get hurt and disappointed by people I love the most. I think too much and too long about problem solving. I sometimes allow my emotions to sometimes dictate or control my actions. By evaluating the positives and negatives associated with my behavioral blend, I can now understand how this can affect my communication with others. Next slide, please. According to Burley Allen, listening can be specified in 3 levels based on the behaviors that affect listening efficiency. The author outlined the 3 levels as Level 1, empathetic listening. Listeners refrain from judging the talker and places themselves in the other's position. Level 2, hearing words but not really listening. People stay at the surface of the communication and do not understand the deeper meaning of what's being said. And Level 3, listening in spurts, tuning in and tuning out, being somewhat aware of others, but mainly paying attention to oneself. Next slide, please. As you know, as humans, naturally, we have a tendency to develop roadblocks or barriers that can affect the way in which we communicate interpersonally. My barriers include, and I promise they're not limited to, being a rescuer. According to Burley Allen, rescuers are advice givers that take on the other person's issues or circumstances and make it their own problem to solve. I must learn that being an empathetic listener will not and does not require solving the issue or problem single-handedly. Another barrier of mine is my defensive behaviors. According to Stewart, defensive behavior is defined as that behavior which occurs when an individual perceives threat or anticipates threat in the group. Naturally or based on pure habit, if a phrase or statement is directed to me that could affect me negatively, my family, or my friends, I would oftentimes find myself becoming defensive. Similar to wildlife, no matter the danger, most animals will protect their family and territory at all costs. I must understand and learn that every statement that I may not agree with does not dictate who I am, and everyone is very much entitled to having an opinion or thought, no matter the subject matter being discussed at the time of conversation. Next slide, please. Noise pollution can interfere with my ability to be an effective listener and or communicator. Internal noise pollution, for me, are my biased listening, which involves forming an opinion about the level and value of what's being said. Hearing what I want to hear and not effectively listening to what the message is being conveyed by the talker. Pressures brought on by others around me. For example, and this is a really big one for me, by wanting to help everyone in my pathway, it can sometimes become a rather difficult task for me to say no. This has been proven to be a very hard balancing act while trying to take on my own personal tasks and life requirements. It can sometimes be too much for me to handle or for me to take ownership of. Internal noise pollution includes stormy weather. I don't like it at all. Being in unfamiliar area or around people I don't know, talking in a monotone voice, too slow, too fast, sometimes I just can't keep up. Next slide, please. Interpersonal communication has many attributes that can help distinguish its importance in today's society. When we communicate, so oftentimes we find ourselves in a whirlwind of words that can affect our identities or the way in which individuals perceive us. Through the guidance of my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, my instructor, and this course, I have developed my plan of action that can help me to be successful and to reach my overarching goal in communication. Next slide, please. Becoming a more effective listener and communicator, I will require myself to address the negatives associated with my behavioral blend. For example, knowing that it's okay to say no to others sometimes, because most oftentimes they will still like me. Unfortunately, or ultimately, I really need to stop worrying about being likable. Likeable is a natural concern, according to Hatfield and Walster, and it can directly affect conversation with my friends, family, co-workers, and other superiors. I will try my best to implement Peterson's talker-listener card to improve direct communication with others. I want to be a more level 1 listener, an empathetic listener. When conflict arises and I want to understand communication balancing, I will listen to Peterson. Listen for a while, talk until the other person stops hearing, and listening until the person calms enough to hear again. I will avoid the flat brain syndrome when emotions are high in conversations. Others are the problem complex, as explained by Peterson. I will watch my verbal and nonverbal cues that could hinder my advancement in conversation. My social problems can be traced to interpersonal communication difficulties, just as many proposed interventions to solve social ills also really depend on effective interpersonal communication, as presented by Burgoon, Berger, and Walden. Let's look at listening as a 7-step process: hearing, selecting, attending, understanding, evaluating, remembering, and most importantly, responding effectively with feedback. And last but certainly not least, I will continue to look to God for my guidance and strength through His Word. Next slide, please. Thanks for viewing my interpersonal communication project for Human Services 508. As always, I would like to leave on a positive note with a positive word from God. James 1:19 and 20 says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to listen, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Thank you so much. This ends my class presentation. Thank you.